Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a world that most of us learnt about in school with a kind of reverent admiration. Democracy, philosophy, sculpture, the Olympics, the birth of Western civilization, all that. And it's not that any of that is wrong exactly. It's just that it's dramatically, almost comically incomplete. Because ancient Greece, for all its marble columns and enduring ideas, was also a place where the gap between what we've been told and what was actually happening on any given Tuesday is wide enough to fall into and not immediately find the bottom of. Before we get into it, if you're new here and this kind of calm, unhurried journey through history is the sort of thing that helps your brain finally stop doing whatever it does at midnight, please consider subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal. And when you've found your favourite section tonight, drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and there is something very specific about finding out which particular piece of ancient strangeness lodged itself in someone's brain at 1 a.m. Now ancient Greece. The version most of us carry around is a kind of golden highlight reel, Socrates asking difficult questions in the agora, athletes competing in good faith beneath the Mediterranean sun, citizens gathering to vote, inventing the very concept of collective self-governance. And those things happened. The philosophy was real, the art was extraordinary, the intellectual ambition was, in many ways, genuinely remarkable. But citizenship belonged to a very narrow slice of the population. The democracy was built on a foundation of enslaved human beings who had no voice in any of it. Infants were left outside to die if someone in the household decided they weren't wanted. Women moved through their own homes with significant restrictions on where they could go and who they could speak to. Warfare wasn't an emergency. It was a season, and medicine, such as it was, operated in a space somewhere between observation and ritual sacrifice, often within the same afternoon. None of this was hidden. None of it was considered shameful. It was simply the texture of ordinary life in a civilization that was, in many genuine ways, philosophically sophisticated and practically brutal at the same time. That tension is what we're here to sit with tonight. It's also worth saying early on that ancient Greece was not a single unified place with a single unified set of customs. Athens and Sparta alone were so different in their approach to childhood, warfare, women, and the basic business of being alive that they might as well have been separate civilizations sharing a coastline and a language. So as we move through tonight's topics, city-state and century will matter, and where something was more particular to one place, we'll note it. We're going to move through all of it slowly. Slavery and infants, marriage and medicine, religion and warfare, and the very strange arrangements that governed relationships between people of unequal ages and unequal power. We'll look at what daily life actually felt like for the majority of people living inside a civilization we tend to discuss as though everyone in it was a philosopher with opinions about the good life. Some of them were. Most of them were just trying to survive it. So get comfortable, settle in. The ancient world is patient, and it has been waiting a very long time to tell you what it was actually like. Let's begin. When a child was born in ancient Greece, the question of whether it would live was not settled by the birth itself. The birth was, in a sense, only the beginning of an audition. In Athens and in many other city-states, the decision about whether a newborn would be accepted into the family belonged to the father, not to the mother, not to the household collectively, not to any external authority. To the father, who had not necessarily been present for the birth, who received the news from the women of the house, and who then made a determination. If he accepted the child, it was lifted from the ground, a gesture with a specific name and a specific social weight. If he did not accept it, the child was exposed, placed outside, usually in a clay pot or a basket, or simply on the ground at a crossroads or a hillside or the base of a city wall, and left there. This was not a secret practice conducted in the dark by desperate people who knew they were doing something wrong. It was a recognized household decision embedded in the legal and social structure of Greek life, discussed by philosophers, regulated in some places, unremarked upon in others. Aristotle, who had opinions about most things, addressed it directly. He argued in his Politics that there should be a law against raising children who are deformed. This was not a fringe position. It was the kind of thing a respected thinker could put in a written work and expect a reasonable audience to consider seriously. The reasons a father might refuse to lift the child were various, and the range of them tells you something important about how Greek society organized its priorities. Poverty was a significant factor. A household that could not feed another mouth had a calculation to make, and the calculation did not necessarily come out in favor of the infant. Illegitimacy was another. A child born outside a recognized marriage carried legal complications around inheritance and citizenship that made its existence inconvenient in ways that could be measured in property. Disability or physical weakness was grounds for exposure in many city-states, and in Sparta the matter was taken entirely out of the father's hands. In Sparta, elders examined newborns, and those judged insufficiently robust were thrown from a cliff on Mount Apothetes. This was not cruelty in the Spartan framework. It was resource management applied at the earliest possible stage. And then there was sex. Female infants were exposed at considerably higher rates than male infants across much of the Greek world. A daughter required a dowry. She would leave the household upon marriage, taking resources with her rather than producing them. She would not fight, not inherit, not carry the family name or the family property forward in any of the ways that mattered to Greek inheritance law. She was in the cold arithmetic of household economics, a liability in a way that her son was not. This is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is what the evidence indicates, and the exposure rates for girls reflected it with a consistency that cannot be explained by any other factor. The modern reflex when encountering this practice is to reach immediately for the emotional register we apply to infants, which is the register of unconditional love and the absolute protection of the helpless. That reflex is not wrong, but it is worth sitting with the fact that it is also recent, culturally specific, and the product of a set of circumstances that did not exist in ancient Greece. Childhood mortality was extraordinary. Many children who were accepted into families and given names and loved by their parents died anyway before the age of 5 from disease, from malnutrition, from the general indifference of the ancient world to human survival, in a context where attachment to a newborn frequently ended in grief regardless of choice. The emotional logic of the household operated differently. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation of how people can do something that looks from a sufficient distance incomprehensible and have it feel from inside their own lives like a rational response to circumstances they did not choose. What happened to exposed infants was not uniform. Death was certainly one outcome, particularly for infants left in isolated locations in cold weather without the intervention of anyone passing by who had a reason to stop. But exposed infants were also rescued with some regularity. The crossroads and the city walls where exposure was common were also places where people passed frequently, and the options for someone who found an exposed infant were not limited to leaving it. Some were taken in by childless couples. Some were taken by households that needed labor and raised as slaves. Some were adopted formally. Some ended up in arrangements that were neither adoption nor slavery, but occupied a social category, somewhere between the two that defied easy classification. The uncertainty itself mattered to Greek thinking about exposure in interesting ways. A father who exposed a child rather than killing it outright could maintain to himself and to others a certain moral distance from the outcome. He had not killed the child. He had placed it where it might be found. The child's fate was, in this framing, transferred to the gods and to fortune. Whether this distinction represented a genuine ethical scruple or a convenient self-deception is the kind of question that Greek philosophers were, to their credit, quite capable of asking. Whether they asked it about exposure specifically is a more complicated matter. The practice appears in Greek comedy and tragedy in ways that treat it as a recognized feature of the world rather than an outrage. In Menander's comedies, exposed infants who are later recognized and returned to their families are a plot device. In Sophocles, Oedipus's entire tragedy begins with an exposure that did not go as planned. The fact that exposure was dramatic enough to anchor major works of literature is itself a form of normalization. It was a thing that happened, that everyone knew happened, that was interesting and consequential when its outcomes were surprising, and entirely unremarkable when they were not. Citizenship was a shaping force underneath all of this. In Athens, citizenship was a specific and valuable legal status that carried real privileges, and it was transmitted through legitimate birth to a citizen father, and from 451 BC onward, under Pericles' citizenship law, a citizen mother as well. A child who could not be presented as the legitimate offspring of two Athenian citizens had no path to citizenship. A child born to a foreigner, to a slave, or outside a recognized union was legally outside the citizen body before it was old enough to understand what that meant. Exposure was in some cases not simply about the economics of feeding another child. It was about what kind of person that child would be allowed to become. A child who could not inherit, who could not be a citizen, who would never be a free participant in the political life of the city, was a child whose existence carried a different weight in the household calculation. This is a cold piece of logic. It was also the logic that operated. Inheritance worked alongside citizenship in shaping these decisions. Greek property moved through legitimate male heirs in patterns that made the sex and the legal status of children directly relevant to what would happen to the family's land and goods across generations. Too many sons created its own complications, dividing estates that were more viable intact. Too many daughters created dowry obligations that could destabilize a household. The infant lying in the clay pot at the crossroads was not merely a small person. It was a claim on resources, a legal position, a potential heir or liability, and a member of a status group that the city-state tracked with considerable precision. The Greek world produced philosophical traditions that are still taught today, partly because they were willing to ask very large questions about justice and the good life. Plato thought carefully about how an ideal society ought to treat its members. Aristotle taxonomized virtue with an attention to detail that staggers the modern reader. And both men, alongside most of their intellectual contemporaries, lived in and wrote for a world where an infant could be placed at the base of a wall and left there on a Tuesday morning without anyone filing a report or calling a magistrate or experiencing anything recognizable as a social crisis. The philosophy and the practice coexisted. They breathed the same air. Citizens discussed the nature of justice in the agora, and then went home to households operating under rules that most of the people physically present in the city had no voice in at all. That coexistence is the thing to hold on to as we move through the rest of the Greek world tonight. Not that the Greeks were uniquely monstrous, not that the philosophy was therefore worthless, but that sophistication and brutality are not opposites. They have never been opposites. They have always been quite comfortable sharing a coastline. The child who survived the first hours, who was lifted from the ground and accepted into the household, entered a world with a fairly precise plan already laid out for it. If it was a boy, that plan involved citizenship, military service, the possibility of a career in politics or philosophy or trade, and eventually a marriage he would contract on his own behalf when he was ready. If it was a girl, the plan was simpler, shorter, and almost entirely controlled by other people. The marriage would happen when her father decided it should, to whoever her father decided it should be with, at an age that the Greeks considered appropriate, and that the modern world would consider something else entirely. The minimum age for a Greek bride was typically around 14. The actual age was frequently around that mark or slightly below. The groom was often in his 30s. This was not considered an odd pairing. It was considered a sensible one. A man in his 30s had established himself, had property, had demonstrated he was capable of maintaining a household. A girl in her early teens was, in the Greek framework, at the beginning of her fertile years, unformed enough in her habits and expectations to be shaped by her new household's routines, and without the inconvenient history of preferences or relationships that an older woman might bring with her. The age gap was a feature, not a coincidence. It was baked into the logic of what marriage was understood to be. And what marriage was understood to be was not a love match. It was an alliance, a transfer, really, of a woman and her associated resources from one household's management to another's. The father of the bride, or in his absence a male guardian called a kyrios, negotiated the terms. The woman herself was not a party to this negotiation in any legal sense. She did not agree to the marriage, she was given in it. The Greek verb used for this transaction was the same verb you would use for giving any object from one person to another. The linguistic choice was not accidental. The dowry travelled with her. This was a substantial sum of money, goods, or property that the bride's family transferred to the groom at the time of the marriage, and its function was both economic and symbolic. Economically, it provided the new household with capital and gave the groom a tangible reason to accept the match. Symbolically, it represented the bride's share of her father's estate, paid out in advance, because she would not inherit in the way her brothers would. She had received her portion, the account was, in a sense, settled. The dowry also came with an important legal provision, in Athens at least. If the marriage dissolved, the dowry was supposed to be returned. This gave the wife's family a financial interest in her welfare, and gave the husband a reason not to simply discard her without cause, since doing so carried a cost. It was not a protection built around the woman's dignity or well-being. It was a protection built around property, which happened to also protect her. The engagement itself, called the engie, was a formal agreement between the father and the groom conducted in front of witnesses. It was a contract. The bride's name does not appear prominently in the surviving records of these agreements. What appears is her father's name, the groom's name, the dowry amount, and the terms. She was the subject of the contract rather than a party to it. Whether she had met her future husband before the day of the wedding, whether she had any impression of him at all, whether anyone had thought to ask, varied from family to family and from city to city, and is not, on the whole, reflected in the legal framework, because the legal framework did not consider her opinion an operative variable. Once married, the wife's primary function was understood with great clarity by everyone involved. She was there to produce legitimate heirs, not children generally, legitimate heirs specifically. The emphasis on legitimacy was not sentimental. It was legal and economic. A man's property, his citizenship rights, his household gods, his claim on his family tomb, all of these passed through legitimate male offspring. An heir who could be challenged as illegitimate was a threat to everything the household had accumulated across generations. The wife was, in this framework, the guarantor of legitimacy. Her fidelity was not principally about the husband's feelings. It was about ensuring that the children she produced were unambiguously his. The enclosed domestic life expected of respectable Athenian wives, the restriction to the women's quarters, the limited contact with men outside the household, the expectation that she would not be seen in public without specific purpose, all of this was in large part a system for managing that guarantee. Fertility was not optional. A wife who did not produce children, or who produced only daughters, or who produced children who died in infancy, occupied an increasingly precarious position in the household. Greek law in Athens permitted divorce for infertility, and the initiative for divorce, like almost everything else, rested with the husband. He could simply send her back to a family, returning the dowry as required, and that was the end of it. The wife could technically initiate a legal separation, but had to appear before an archon to do so. and the practical barriers to a woman navigating that process alone, without legal standing, without public voice, were considerable enough that it happened rarely and is documented even more rarely. What the wife was not expected to provide, or at least what the surviving literature and legal customs do not emphasize, was companionship in the deeper sense. The emotional intimacy that the modern world places at the center of marriage, the expectation that a husband and wife are each other's primary confidants, intellectual partners, the people to whom they turn when something goes wrong or right or interesting. This was not the organizing principle of elite Athenian marriage. The women's quarters and the men's quarters of a prosperous household were largely separate worlds. The husband spent his days in the agora, in conversation with other men, in the social life of the symposium, in political and commercial activity. The wife managed the household, supervised the slaves, controlled the storerooms, raised the children. These were real responsibilities, genuinely valued ones, and Greek texts are not entirely dismissive of domestic competence. Xenophon's O Economicus, a work specifically about household management, treats the wife's role with a certain respect. But the respect is the respect you give to good administration. It is not the respect of partnership between equals. Xenophon's husband in that text compares training his young wife to training a puppy. He means this warmly. He is describing the patient instruction of someone who does not yet know how to do things his way and must be taught. The wife in the dialogue is grateful for the instruction. She is pleased to have been shaped. This is presented as a model marriage. The puppy comparison is offered without any evident awareness that it might land awkwardly, because in the world the text was written for, it did not land awkwardly at all. It landed as a reasonable description of what a good husband did. The Spartans managed the institution differently in ways that surprised and slightly scandalized other Greeks. Spartan women were better fed, more physically active, less confined to domestic interiors, and married at an older age than their Athenian counterparts, typically in their late teens rather than their early teens. This was not sentiment. It was Spartan logic applied to reproduction. A stronger, older, better nourished woman would produce stronger children, which was the point of the whole exercise. The emotional content of Spartan marriage was, if anything, even more attenuated than the Athenian version, since Spartan men lived in military barracks until age 30 and conducted their marriages largely through nocturnal visits to a wife they spent most of their time not seeing. The connection between husband and wife was not the central relationship of either person's daily life. It was a productive arrangement conducted at intervals. All of this, the contracts and the age gaps and the legitimacy requirements and the domestic confinement and the dowries, handed over like property transfers, operated inside a framework that genuinely believed it was well ordered. The Greeks were not unaware that they were organizing something. They were quite deliberate about it. The marriage system was understood as a pillar of social stability, a mechanism for transmitting property and citizenship cleanly across generations, and a structure for managing the always complicated matter of who belonged to whom and who owned what. That it also required the systematic reduction of half the population to a legal status somewhere between person and managed resource was not, for the most part, the part they dwelled on. A woman who had been given in marriage, whose dowry had been transferred and whose new household had received her, did not thereby achieve any meaningful independence. She moved from one set of controls to another. The male guardian she had lived under as a daughter, her father or nearest male relative in his absence, was replaced by a husband who now occupied that functional position over her. The Greek term for this guardianship was kyrios. Every free woman in Athens had one. A girl had her father, a married woman had her husband, a widow had her son if he was old enough, or her nearest male relative if he was not, or in some circumstances the state made arrangements. But the arrangement was always the same in structure. There was always a man. There was always one. The Kyrios was not a formality. He was a legal necessity. A woman in Athens could not own property above a very modest threshold, could not enter into contracts, could not conduct business transactions, could not appear in court on her own behalf. Any legal matter that touched her life, any purchase of significance, any agreement, any dispute requiring official resolution, required a man to stand in front of it and speak for it. She did not represent herself. She was represented. The distinction was not subtle, and it was not accidental. Movement was similarly managed. The respectable Athenian woman, and respectability was the thing everything else was organized around, was expected to spend the overwhelming majority of her time inside her own house, not under explicit lock and key generally, but under the weight of expectations so precisely defined that the lock was largely unnecessary. She might go out for specific purposes. Religious festivals were an important exception, and women participated in certain civic religious functions that gave them a degree of public presence the rest of their lives did not. Funerals required attendance. A trip to a neighbour's house, properly chaperoned, was permissible. But the general principle was that a woman seen frequently in public spaces, in the agora, in the streets, speaking with men she was not related to, conducting herself with visible independence, was a woman whose reputation was already under question. The outside world was male space. Her presence in it required justification. The inner rooms of the house, the gyneconitis, the women's quarters were her domain. This was not nothing. She managed the household, controlled the storerooms, supervised the slaves who did the physical labour, directed the textile work that was a primary domestic industry, and raised children through their early years. These were real functions, and the Greeks said so with reasonable frequency. But the domain was enclosed. It was hers in the way that a territory is under administration. She governed it. She did not leave it without cause. When male guests came to dinner, she withdrew. The symposium was not for her. The political conversation, the philosophical debate, the easy, sociable public life of Athenian men, moving through their city as though they owned it, which legally and practically they did. None of this was available to the woman folding cloth in the back rooms of the same house. Her reputation was not merely a personal matter. It was a family asset. An Athenian woman's sexual honour, her demonstrated modesty, her visible restriction from male company, her absence from situations that might generate talk, reflected directly on the men responsible for her. A daughter whose behaviour was questionable made her father's household questionable. A wife who attracted gossip made her husband's honour questionable. The woman carried the family's moral weight in a specific and uneven way. Men could move through the world accruing various experiences without those experiences necessarily threatening the family name. A woman's value, socially and in terms of the marriage market, and the household alliances that marriage created, was tied to a reputation for modesty and containment that one poorly observed evening could damage irrecoverably. She could not speak in political assemblies. She was not a citizen in the operative sense. Citizenship in Athens, which Athenians were profoundly proud of and theorized about extensively, was organized around participation in public life, in the assembly, the courts, the military. Women were excluded from all of it. They were Athenians in some cultural sense, the daughters and wives of citizens, the mothers of future citizens, and this last role was considered enormously important. But they did not participate. They produced and maintained the men who participated. The distinction was considered appropriate. The philosophers who thought carefully about the nature of citizenship and the good life did not, on the whole, find it troubling that half the people they lived among were excluded from it. Aristotle thought women naturally deficient in deliberative capacity. This was not a fringe opinion. It was the kind of view that showed up in careful philosophical argument, as though it had been demonstrated rather than assumed. Sparta, as with several other things, arranged this differently, and the rest of Greece noticed. Spartan women moved more freely. They exercised in public, which Athenians found alternately admirable and slightly alarming. They managed significant property, particularly when Spartan men were away on campaign, or living in military housing, which was most of the time. They had opinions and were observed to express them. Spartan men apparently did not find this threatening to the social order, or rather they found a strong woman who produced strong children more useful than a secluded one. The control was still there. The purpose was still reproduction and household maintenance. But the mechanism was looser, and the result was women who occupied a more visible position in their own society than their Athenian counterparts could have imagined as normal life. In Athens, the controls were presented not as restrictions but as protections. The enclosed life was the dignified life. A woman kept safe from public exposure was a woman whose honour was intact, whose children's legitimacy was unquestionable, whose household was in good order. The system worked, in its own terms, as a system for managing property and legitimacy and family reputation across generations. That it required a person to spend her life as a managed resource rather than as someone with standing to manage her own affairs was not, in the Greek framework, a problem requiring a solution. It was the solution. It was how order was maintained. The women who lived inside it were largely invisible to history, for the same reason they were largely invisible to their contemporaries. The records were kept by men, about men, and the back rooms where she organised the grain jars and supervised the wool and raised the children who would go on to be recorded did not generate much documentation. She was there. The system required her to be. That was in the end more or less all it required. Beneath the women in the gynaeconitis, beneath the husband conducting business in the agora, beneath the philosophical conversation, and the civic pride and the careful management of family reputation, there was another layer entirely. There were the enslaved people. And without them, almost nothing else in Athenian life as it has been described and admired and taught in schools for several centuries would have been possible. Slavery in ancient Greece was not a feature of the system. It was the system. It was the substrate on which everything else rested. The household that kept a free woman modestly contained and productively occupied ran on enslaved labour doing the physical work that made the household function. The craftsman in the workshop directed enslaved workers who did significant portions of the skilled and unskilled labour alike. The farmer who owned a modest plot and considered himself a free man of modest means might own 2 or 3 enslaved people, and the wealthy landowner might own dozens. The silver mines at Laurion, whose output financed Athenian naval power and by extension the golden age of Athenian culture, were worked almost entirely by enslaved people, under conditions that require some effort to describe without reaching for language that feels excessive and turns out to be accurate. The question of how many enslaved people lived in Athens at any given time during the classical period is genuinely difficult to answer precisely because the records were not kept with that question in mind. Estimates for the 5th and 4th centuries suggest that enslaved people may have constituted somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the total population of Attica. Some scholars put it higher. What is clear is that they were everywhere. They were in every household above the poverty line. They were in workshops, in fields, on ships, in the harbour, in the administrative offices where they worked as secretaries and record keepers, in the police force, where a corps of enslaved Scythian archers served as something like Athens's public order enforcement. The city could not have administered itself without them. A person became enslaved through several routes, and none of them required any particular moral failing or social vulnerability on their own part. War was the most reliable source of enslaved people. A city that lost a military engagement might find its entire population, men, women, and children, sold into slavery as a matter of standard practice. The Athenians did this to others and were aware that others might do it to them, which is a fact that seemed to trouble them somewhat less than you might expect. Piracy supplied enslaved people continuously. Traders moved them around the Mediterranean as a routine cargo. Children born to enslaved mothers were enslaved at birth. Some people were sold into slavery under pressure of debt, though Athenian law after Solon's reforms in the early 6th century prohibited debt slavery for Athenian citizens specifically, which meant the supply had to come from somewhere else, and it did. The range of experience within slavery was vast in a way that did not make the institution less disturbing, but did make it more complicated. A trusted household slave who had served one family for decades, who managed accounts, who accompanied children to school, who was consulted on domestic matters, occupied a very different daily life than the men in the silver mines at Laurion, who worked in shifts underground in low tunnels, extracting ore in conditions that generated a life expectancy that the Greeks understood was short and appear to have considered an acceptable operating cost. The Laurian mines were Athens's economic engine. The enslaved workers who powered that engine were fed enough to keep working and replaced when they couldn't. There is no recorded instance of an Athenian politician standing up in the assembly to suggest this was a problem. It was where the money came from. What none of these experiences, however relatively comfortable some of them were, could change was the fundamental legal and social fact. An enslaved person in Greece had no legal personhood. They could not own property. They could not enter into contracts. They could not appear in court as a witness without being tortured first, because Greek legal practice held that testimony from an enslaved person was only reliable if extracted under duress, which tells you something precise about what the legal system thought of the people it was torturing for information. They could be sold. They could be hired out by their owners. They could be beaten. They could be sexually used. The only constraint was the owner's self-interest, which occasionally suggested that destroying valuable property was economically unwise. This was not protection. It was a calculation. The free citizens who depended on all of this did not experience it as a contradiction. The philosophers who produced careful arguments about human virtue and the good life and the nature of justice did not, on the whole, find slavery conceptually destabilizing. Aristotle addressed it directly and concluded that some people were natural slaves, suited by their nature to be governed rather than to govern, and that slavery was therefore a natural institution. He thought this was an argument, not an assumption, which is one of the more unsettling demonstrations in the history of philosophy of what intelligent people can convince themselves of when the conclusion is sufficiently convenient. Plato's Republic, which imagined an ideal city organized by reason and virtue, assumed enslaved labor as part of its backdrop without particularly examining it. The examined life apparently had limits. The leisure that allowed Athenian men to attend the assembly, to argue philosophy, to watch plays, to exercise in the gymnasium, to conduct the political participation they considered the highest expression of human civilization. That leisure was purchased by the unpaid, coerced labor of people who had no access to any of it. The culture that produced the Parthenon and the tragedies of Sophocles and the dialogues of Plato produced them on the backs of people who could be sold away from their children on a Tuesday morning without any legal mechanism to prevent it. This is not a revisionist observation. The Greeks knew where the labor was coming from. They just did not find it incompatible with everything else they were building. That was what made it so completely, unremarkably normal. Sparta solved the problem of turning children into soldiers by deciding that children were not really children at all. They were soldiers at an early stage of production, and the appropriate response was to begin the manufacturing process as soon as possible and apply significant heat throughout. The system had a name, the agoge. It was compulsory, state-controlled, and began at age 7, when Spartan boys were removed from their families and placed into collective training units called Agili, which translates roughly as herds, which tells you something immediately about the conceptual framework. You were not a child being educated. You were a young animal being shaped for a specific function, The state had decided what that function was before you were born, and the agoge was the mechanism by which the decision was enforced. Before the agoge could claim you, however, you had to survive the inspection. Newborn Spartan infants were brought to a place called the Lesha, where a council of elders examined them. The examination was not sentimental, it was structural. A child who appeared strong and well-formed was returned to the family to be raised to fighting age. A child who appeared weak, malformed, or insufficiently promising was taken to a place called the Hetairai, a set of cliffs near Sparta, and exposed there to die. The decision about who was fit to be a Spartan was made not by the parents but by the state, because the child did not belong to the parents in any way the Spartans considered primary. The child belonged to Sparta, and Sparta had standards. Plutarch reports this practice in his Life of Lycurgus, where he describes it with the calm of someone explaining a sensible administrative procedure. The Spartans themselves would have agreed with that framing. The purpose was clarity. Sparta needed soldiers. It had no use for people who could not be soldiers. The inspection was simply the earliest point at which that determination could be made. That this determination was made about people who were several days old and incapable of demonstrating anything except that they had survived birth was a detail the Spartan civic philosophy appears to have processed without significant difficulty. At 7, those who had survived infancy were handed to the state. The family did not disappear entirely from the picture, but it ceased to be the organizing center of a boy's life in any meaningful sense. You ate with your unit, you slept with your unit, you were disciplined by your unit's commanders and by older boys assigned to supervise younger ones. Physical punishment was constant and was understood not as a response to wrongdoing, but as a training tool. Pain was the curriculum. Endurance was the lesson. A boy who cried out during a beating had failed the test. The beating was not the punishment. Crying out was the failure. Food was deliberately insufficient. Boys were kept hungry as a policy, not as a punishment or the result of shortage, but because hunger was believed to develop cunning, self-reliance, and physical sharpness. If you wanted more food, you stole it. Stealing was not punished. Being caught stealing was punished severely because being caught demonstrated incompetence rather than moral error. Plutarch records the story, possibly apocryphal, but revealing in any case, of a Spartan boy who had stolen a fox and hidden it beneath his cloak, and who allowed the fox to gnaw through his stomach rather than reveal what he was concealing, dying without making a sound. The story was told admiringly. The fox, the concealment, the silence, and the death were all on the right side of the ledger. Only the being caught would have been a failure. Boys slept on beds of reeds they cut themselves from the river Eurotas with their bare hands, because reeds cut from the bank with bare hands in cold water were harder to collect than reeds cut with a blade, and difficulty was the point. They went without shoes to toughen their feet. They had one cloak for all seasons, so they learned to bear cold. They were required to exercise naked so that pride in physical condition would be cultivated alongside the condition itself. The state had opinions about everything. What was being built, the Spartans would have told you, was the greatest possible military force, and they were not wrong about the results. Sparta produced soldiers of extraordinary discipline and cohesion who performed at Thermopylae and elsewhere in ways that remain remarkable at significant historical distance. The 300 who held the pass at Thermopylae were not a specially selected elite. They were simply adult products of the agoge, and the agoge had made them genuinely difficult to stop. The system worked for what the system was designed for. What the system also produced, though this was not the part the Spartans chose to emphasize, was a population of men whose relationship to tenderness, to family, to individual interiority, and to anything that wasn't military function had been systematically dismantled over the course of their childhood. Spartan men continued to live in their communal messes, their syssitia, even after marriage. A Spartan man who married would visit his wife in secret at night and return to the barracks before daylight, not because secrecy was required legally, but because any visible attachment to domestic life was considered faintly embarrassing. The family was something that happened in the margins of a soldier's real existence. Grief for a fallen soldier was regulated. Excessive mourning was discouraged. You lost a son. Sparta required another one. The machinery had little room for extended sentiment. The Athenians, who were rivals and neighbours and who also did not have a spotless record on the treatment of children, found the Spartan system somewhat alarming even from where they were standing. Visitors from other Greek cities wrote about it with a mixture of reluctant admiration and unease that suggests even the ancient world recognized that something about it had been pushed past a point. The harshness was praised because the results were admired. The cruelty was absorbed into the vocabulary of civic virtue so completely that the Spartans did not need to defend it. They simply pointed at the soldiers it produced and waited for anyone to argue with the evidence. Nobody watching a Spartan phalanx hold a position was in a strong position to argue. The Spartans were not alone in having strong institutional opinions about boys. The Greeks more broadly had developed in certain cities and certain social contexts a set of arrangements involving adult men and adolescent boys that they considered not merely acceptable but admirable, educationally productive, and in some formulations morally superior to other kinds of relationships. This requires some explanation, and the explanation is uncomfortable, and both of those things are true simultaneously. The institution is called Pederastia, from which the modern English word is derived, though the modern word carries a clinical and criminal weight that the ancient Greek term did not, which is part of what makes this particular piece of history so difficult to discuss without either sanitizing it into irrelevance or collapsing it into simple condemnation that obscures what was actually happening and why. In Athens and in a number of other Greek cities, a formalized relationship between an Orestes and an Eromenos, an older man and a younger male, typically somewhere between 12 and 17, was understood as a recognized social institution embedded in the structure of elite education. The Orestes was an adult citizen. The Eromenos was a boy of good family who had not yet reached full citizenship age. The relationship was understood to involve mentorship, intellectual formation, and the transmission of civic virtue from an older generation to a younger one. The older man guided the boy into political life, into philosophical thinking, into the behavioral codes of the citizen class. He introduced him to his networks. He modeled what an adult Athenian man was supposed to be. This was the idealized version, and the Greeks discussed it in those terms with considerable enthusiasm. The Greeks also discussed at some length and with reasonably clear eyes the desire involved. This is where the idealized version and the actual version begin to diverge in ways that the Greeks themselves partly acknowledged and partly arranged not to examine too directly. Plato's Symposium, one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy, is organized substantially around the question of what kind of love between men and boys is noble and what kind is base. The distinction the participants draw is between a love oriented toward the soul, toward the education and improvement of the younger person, and a love oriented toward the body which is cast as shameful and dishonorable. This is a meaningful distinction philosophically. It is also a distinction made by people who were clearly aware that the body was part of the picture and who were working somewhat hard to argue it shouldn't be. The social rules were specific and did not pretend the physical dimension didn't exist. What was considered honorable was the posture of the eromenos, a boy who actively sought out such relationships, who showed enthusiasm for physical contact, who appeared to derive pleasure from it, was considered to have disgraced himself. The proper performance was reluctant acceptance, passive endurance, attention to the spiritual and educational benefits while remaining above the physical transaction. This construction in which the younger party was supposed to maintain dignity by showing as little engagement as possible tells you something quite direct about the nature of the power imbalance being navigated. The rules were arranged to protect the adult's reputation. They were not arranged to protect the boy. Citizenship and masculinity were deeply entangled with all of this. To be a free adult male Athenian citizen was to be the kind of person who acted, who penetrated, who held active social power. To be in the subordinate position in any relationship, physical or social, was to occupy the feminine role, which the Athenian framework considered inherently lesser. Boys could occupy this position temporarily because they had not yet become full citizens, were not yet fully men, and would graduate out of it into active citizenship. A man who continued to occupy the passive position as an adult was mocked, demeaned, treated as having failed to complete the transition to full masculine status. The terminology used to describe such men in Athenian comedy is not gentle. The same act that was idealized when it involved a boy becoming educated was considered a humiliation when it involved a man choosing to remain in the younger role. The ethics were organized entirely around status and category, not around what was happening physically. Sparta had its own version, which is perhaps unsurprising given how completely that society had organized itself around male communal life. Spartan pederastic relationships were also theoretically organized around military mentorship, older soldiers sponsoring younger ones, taking responsibility for their training and development. The Spartans were characteristically more straightforward about the physical component than the Athenians, who wrapped the same institution in considerably more philosophical packaging. Neither version was, by any modern framework for thinking about consent, age-appropriate contact, or the power dynamics between adults and minors, anything other than what it was. It is worth resisting the flattening impulse here. Not all Greek societies organized these relationships the same way. In Crete, the forms were different. In Corinth, the attitudes were different. There was no single Greek position on this, any more than there was a single Greek position on anything. What was consistent across the variations was the structural feature that the arrangement was defined entirely by adults, conducted on terms established by adults, evaluated according to criteria that measured the adult's honour, and placed the younger party in a position where the socially correct performance was not resistance, not refusal, but a kind of dignified passivity that the culture then praised as evidence of good character. This is the architecture of a system designed to make exploitation legible as virtue. The modern discomfort with this is not anachronistic squeamishness. It is the correct recognition that the presence of social approval does not resolve the underlying problem, which is that one party to these arrangements was a child without the social standing, the legal recourse, or the cultural permission to simply say no. The Greeks had built an elaborate philosophical and civic structure around something whose foundations, examined clearly, do not hold. That they did not examine them clearly, that Plato could write some of the most beautiful prose in Western history while circling around the edges of this without quite looking at it directly, is not a puzzle about hypocrisy. It is evidence of how completely a society can normalize an arrangement by embedding it in the language of its highest values. The institution was not hidden. It was discussed in philosophy, depicted in art, celebrated in poetry, and written into the social expectations of elite Athenian life. That visibility was not transparency. It was armor. What the Greeks embedded in their highest philosophical language, they also embedded in their street corners, their public squares, and the legal machinery of civic life. The gap between celebrated thought and ordinary practice was wide enough to drive a cart through, and the cart, in this case, was loaded with instruments of coercion. Punishment in the ancient Greek world was not a private matter. It was a public one, and the publicness was not incidental. It was the point when a free man was fined, shamed, or stripped of civic rights. The community witnessed it. When an enslaved person was beaten, mutilated, or executed, the community witnessed that too. Visibility was the mechanism through which punishment did its social work, and the Greeks were systematic about ensuring it was visible to the right people for the right lessons to land correctly. For free citizens, the range of legal punishments included fines, disenfranchisement, exile, and death, with the specific penalty varying considerably depending on which city you were in and what the offence was. Athens had a legal system that was by ancient standards remarkably developed, with courts, juries, written laws, and formal procedures for prosecution. It also had the stocks, the pillory, a device called the apatympanismos, which involved binding a condemned person to a plank to die of exposure, and a legal culture in which public shaming was considered both appropriate and effective. The jury courts of Athens could number in the hundreds or thousands of citizens voting on a verdict. The proceedings were public. The verdicts were public. The executions were public. The intention was that civic justice and civic education were the same event, and the citizen watching was the real audience for whom the entire performance was staged. Debt was a mechanism of particular cruelty in much of the Greek world, and for a significant portion of Greek history, failure to repay a debt could result in debt bondage, the reduction of a free person and their family into a condition that was practically indistinguishable from slavery. Solon's reforms in Athens in the early 6th century abolished debt bondage and cancelled existing debt obligations, specifically because the practice had become so pervasive that a significant portion of the Athenian population had effectively enslaved themselves into the households of creditors. The fact that such a dramatic intervention was necessary tells you something about how far the system had been allowed to run before anyone in a position to stop it did. Solon is celebrated as a reformer. He required celebrating because things had gotten that bad. For enslaved people, the situation was categorically different and considerably worse. Enslaved people in the Greek world had no legal standing as persons. They were property, and the treatment of property was at the discretion of the owner, bounded by almost nothing except the occasional concern that damaging someone else's enslaved person constituted damage to property, and therefore a financial claim against the person who had done the damaging. The protection was economic, not moral. It protected the owner's investment. It did not protect the person. Torture of enslaved people was so normalized in the Athenian legal system that it was considered a more reliable method of obtaining testimony than the sworn word of a free person. The logic ran that a free man might lie under oath to protect himself or his associates, but an enslaved person under torture would have no reason to lie and every reason to tell the truth. This logic does not survive contact with any serious thinking about how human beings behave under physical duress, and some Greeks did in fact observe that people say whatever seems most likely to make the pain stop. The observation did not significantly change the practice. The torture of enslaved witnesses was a standard feature of Athenian legal proceedings, requested by litigants as a matter of course, and referenced in court speeches as a mark of evidentiary seriousness. Corporal punishment was the everyday grammar of the enslaved person's life. Beatings were administered for errors, for slowness, for insubance, for any behaviour the owner found inconvenient. The implements used were ordinary domestic objects. There was no special occasion required, and no particular threshold of offence that justified it, because no threshold was legally required. Runaway enslaved people who were caught were often branded on the face or had their ears cut off to mark them and make future escape attempts immediately visible to anyone they encountered. This was not considered excessive. It was considered practical, a deterrent legible at a glance. The spectacle of punishment did something specific to the community that watched it. It drew a line, and the line said clearly and repeatedly that the person being punished was on the wrong side of it, and that the person watching was on the right one. Free citizens watching an enslaved person publicly whipped were receiving a lesson about the category difference between themselves and the person suffering, and that category difference was one of the foundational structures on which Greek civic life depended. The philosophy that celebrated reason, virtue, and the examined life was produced by men whose leisure to examine anything was purchased by the forced labour of people who could be beaten at will. This is not a coincidence of timing. It is a structural relationship. The Athenians, who wrote beautifully about justice, had a specific and limited definition of justice that did not extend to the people grinding grain in their kitchens. Aristotle, who thought carefully about almost everything, argued that some people were natural slaves, suited by their nature to be directed by others, and that this arrangement was not injustice but order. This argument is sometimes charitably interpreted as Aristotle working through a difficult problem in good faith. It can also be read as an extremely sophisticated man building a philosophical superstructure to justify something the economy of his world required, and that he preferred not to feel uncomfortable about. Both readings can be true simultaneously. Cruelty framed as order is still cruelty. Punishment framed as deterrence is still violence. The Greeks were not unique in making this translation, but they were unusually articulate about it, which means the distance between what they said and what they did is unusually well documented. The examined life, as it turned out, was not the same as the just one. The examination had limits, and those limits were enforced by men with instruments in public for an audience that was meant to understand exactly what it was watching. Greek medicine has a reputation that runs well ahead of its actual results. Hippocrates is taught in medical schools. The oath bearing his name is still invoked at graduations. The image of the careful physician, observing, reasoning, rejecting superstition in favour of evidence, has been attached to ancient Greece with such persistence that it is easy to forget what being a patient in that world actually involved. What it involved, in practical terms, was considerable pain, limited knowledge, and a significant probability that the treatment would do as much damage as the disease. The rational inquiry was real. So was the suffering. The Greek medical tradition that descended from Hippocrates and his followers on the island of Kos represented a genuine intellectual achievement. The Hippocratic physicians attempted to explain disease without reference to divine punishment or supernatural interference. Illness, in their framework, was a natural phenomenon with natural causes, observable, analyzable, potentially addressable through intervention. This was not obvious in a world where most cultures attributed sickness directly to the displeasure of gods, the malice of spirits, or the accumulated moral failures of the sufferer. The decision to look at the body itself, rather than through it towards some divine explanation behind it, was a meaningful intellectual step and deserves credit. The trouble was that the framework they substituted for divine explanation, humoral theory, was wrong in ways that produced suffering of its own. The body in humoral medicine was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was their proper balance. Disease was their disruption. The physician's job was to restore equilibrium, and the primary tools for doing so were purging, bloodletting, vomiting, sweating, and dietary restriction. These interventions were not gentle suggestions, they were aggressive physical procedures applied to bodies that were already compromised by illness, and they often made things worse in ways the physicians interpreted as the disease fighting back, rather than as evidence that the treatment itself was harmful. Bloodletting was the intervention with the most persistent grip on Greek and later European medicine. The logic was internally consistent. Too much blood or blood of the wrong quality was disrupting the humoral balance, and removing some of it would restore order. The practice involved cutting a vein, usually at the arm or neck, and draining blood into a bowl until the physician judged that enough had been removed. The amount removed was a matter of judgment, which in practice meant guesswork. Patients who were already weakened by fever, infection, or injury were additionally weakened by the loss of blood, which produced the pallor, faintness, and reduced agitation that practitioners interpreted as signs of improvement. The patient growing quieter and paler was not recovering. They were declining, But the surface presentation matched what the theory predicted success should look like, which made the theory difficult to abandon from the inside. Purging operated on similar logic. If the imbalance was in the digestive humours, evacuation in one direction or the other would clear the excess. Hellebore was a favoured purgative and was administered in doses that induced violent vomiting or diarrhoea or both, along with, at sufficient quantities, severe abdominal cramping, convulsions, and occasionally death. The physicians were aware that hellebore was dangerous. They described calibrating the dose carefully. The calibration was performed without any knowledge of the patient's actual biochemistry, body weight considered only roughly, and individual tolerance entirely unknown. Some patients got better despite the purging. Some did not. Surgery existed and was practiced with tools that would be recognizable to any modern observer: scalpels, probes, bone saws, forceps, and without anything that would be recognizable as effective anesthesia. Wine was administered before procedures. Opium preparations existed and were used. Mandragora, which contains sedative alkaloids, was known. None of these produced unconsciousness reliably, and none of them addressed the fundamental problem that cutting into a human body without sterile instruments, without antibacterial treatment, and without any means of preventing the infection that followed, was an invitation to complications that the initial surgery had not caused, but that it created the conditions for. Greek surgeons set bones, drained abscesses, removed arrowheads and spear tips, and amputated limbs. They did this to fully conscious or minimally sedated patients held down by assistants, and then they dressed the wounds with preparations that occasionally introduced additional contamination and monitored the results through the lens of a theory that was not equipped to identify what was actually happening in the damaged tissue beneath. Cauterization, the application of a heated iron to wounds or surgical sites, was understood to stop bleeding and was correct in this, but it was also performed as a treatment for conditions, including epilepsy, joint disease, and headache, applied to areas of the body that had no mechanical connection to the problem being addressed. Guided by humoral reasoning about where excess heat or imbalance needed to be drawn out. The hot iron on a conscious patient was not administered with apology. It was administered as therapy. Childbirth sat outside formal medical practice almost entirely. Greek physicians wrote about obstetrics with the same theoretical confidence they brought to everything, describing the stages of labour, the optimal position for delivery, interventions for difficult presentations. The women who actually assisted in childbirth were midwives, and the knowledge they carried was practical and experiential, passed between women across generations, which is a form of knowledge that deserves more credit than the historical record typically gives it. But what neither the physicians nor the midwives possessed was any means of addressing the infections that followed delivery, the hemorrhages that could not be controlled, the obstructed labours that could not be resolved. Greek women died in childbirth at rates that would constitute a public health crisis by any modern measure, and this was understood as a feature of female existence rather than as a problem requiring solution. Graves of young women in the ancient world show a consistent demographic pattern. The elevated mortality of the reproductive years, the philosophical tradition that produced extended arguments about the nature of the soul, said relatively little about this. What the patient experienced through all of it was vulnerability of a particularly exposed kind. You went to a physician who possessed genuine learning and genuine confidence, and a framework for understanding your body that was coherent, systematic, and substantially incorrect. He observed carefully. He reasoned seriously. He administered something that hurt considerably, based on principles that were wrong in ways neither of you could have known. And you either recovered, which confirmed the theory, or you did not, which suggested the disease had been stronger than the treatment. The physician survived to treat the next patient. The examined life continued. The body on the table made its own argument, in the only language available to it, and no one in the room was equipped to hear it correctly. The physician who got you wrong could at least be blamed for poor judgment. The gods, by contrast, could not be blamed at all. They could only be appeased, consulted, and feared with a consistency and thoroughness that organized Greek life from the household hearth, to the battlefield, to the assembly floor. Greek religion was not a private matter, not a question of individual conscience or interior faith. It was a public obligation, a civic technology, and a daily negotiation with forces that were understood to be real, present, and deeply interested in whether you had performed the correct ritual, in the correct manner on the correct day, with the correct animal, properly selected, properly consecrated, and properly killed. Animal sacrifice was the central act of Greek religious life, not peripheral to it, not a dramatic special occasion, but the ordinary mechanism by which human beings communicated with the divine. You did not pray in the Greek world the way a later religious tradition might understand prayer. You transacted. You offered something valuable, and in return you sought something: favourable weather, military victory, the recovery of a sick child, good sailing conditions, a successful harvest. The gods received the gift and presumably, if pleased, delivered the outcome. The arrangement was businesslike beneath its sacred surface, which did not make it less sincere. The sensory reality of this arrangement is worth sitting with for a moment, because the tendency to speak of ancient sacrifice in the language of ceremony and ritual obscures what it actually looked and smelled and sounded like. An animal, an ox, a goat, a pig, a sheep selected for its physical perfection, no blemishes, no deformities, nothing that would suggest an insufficient offering, was led to the altar. Participants wore garlands. There was often music, the sound of the olos, a double-piped instrument. The animal was sprinkled with water and with barley grains, an act that caused it to shake its head, which was interpreted as the animal's assent to the proceedings. Then the throat was cut, the blood collected and poured over the altar, and the butchering began in earnest. The inedible portions, the bones wrapped in fat, were burned for the gods. The smoke rose, the smell of burning fat and blood and hair was the smell of worship. The edible portions were distributed and consumed by the participants. Greek sacrifice was, among other things, one of the primary occasions on which ordinary Greeks ate meat, which was expensive and not part of daily diet. The sacred and the practical folded into each other without embarrassment. This happened constantly, at festivals, at the opening of assemblies, before battles, after battles, at weddings and funerals, at the founding of colonies, at the installation of magistrates. A city that went a significant period without performing the correct sacrifices to the correct deities was a city that had, by its own understanding, placed itself in serious danger. The gods noticed absence. They noticed error. They noticed insufficient attention, and their response to insufficient attention was the kind that arrived as plague, military defeat, crop failure, or civic catastrophe, all of which, when they occurred, were examined for the ritual inadequacy that had presumably caused them. This created a world organized around the concept of pollution, which the Greeks called miasma. Certain acts, certain conditions, certain failures of ritual contaminated the individual and, through the individual, the community. Homicide was polluting. Contact with a corpse was polluting. Certain reproductive states were polluting. The polluted person did not merely suffer personally, they offended the gods in ways that might bring consequences down on everyone nearby, which meant that pollution was a community problem, and its removal through ritual purification was a community obligation. The person who had killed, even justifiably, even in battle, required cleansing before they could reintegrate with ordinary social life. The boundary between the sacred and the contaminated required constant management by people with the knowledge and authority to manage it, namely priests and priestesses, whose function was partly ceremonial and partly, from the Greek perspective, a genuine form of civic hygiene. Curses operated by the same logic in reverse. If pollution was the unintended contamination that spread outward from a tainted act, A curse was the deliberate invocation of divine attention toward a specific target. Curse tablets, small sheets of lead inscribed with the name of the target and the desired harm and then deposited in graves, wells, or sacred springs, have been found across the Greek world in substantial numbers. They are not exotic or unusual artifacts, they are routine. People cursed their business rivals, their legal opponents, the person they suspected of sleeping with their spouse, and the athlete they hoped to defeat in a competition. You could commission a curse with the same matter-of-fact practicality with which you might commission a piece of pottery. The gods were understood to be available for this service, particularly the chthonic deities associated with the underworld, who had the relevant jurisdiction over misfortune and death. Hermes, Hecate, and the unnamed powers below received the lead tablets and were expected to act on them. When facing genuinely consequential decisions, states and individuals alike turned to oracles. The oracle at Delphi, where the priestess called the Pythia delivered the gods' responses in a state of divine possession, was consulted before colonies were founded, before wars were declared, before major political changes were undertaken. The responses were often ambiguous, which meant they could be interpreted to fit whatever subsequently occurred, which meant the oracle's reputation survived outcomes that a more precise institution might not have. This was not considered a flaw in the system. It was considered appropriate. The gods spoke in ways that required interpretation, which is to say they spoke in ways that gave the humans doing the interpreting considerable latitude. The entire structure, the sacrifice, the pollution, the curses, the oracles, the omens, read in the flight of birds, and the arrangement of an animal's entrails, normalized a state of sustained sacred vigilance that was, by its own internal coherence, entirely reasonable. In a world where the gods were real and present and responsive to human behavior, ignoring them was not irreligious. It was simply reckless. The Greek who watched the liver of a sacrificed ox with intense attention before committing troops to battle was not being superstitious in the modern dismissive sense. He was consulting the best available information in the only framework he possessed for interpreting it. The fact that the framework was wrong did not mean the attention was misplaced. It meant the universe was less legible than he believed, which is a condition that has not, in the centuries since, entirely been resolved. The Greek who watched the entrails before battle was not merely being careful about the gods. He was being careful about his survival, because in ancient Greece, warfare was not an interruption of normal life. It was a recurring feature of it, as regular as the agricultural calendar, as structurally embedded as the symposium or the festival, and considerably more lethal than either. The Greek city-states were perpetually at war with each other, with their neighbours, with Persian invaders, with former allies, with anyone whose resources, territory, or strategic position made conflict sufficiently attractive or sufficiently urgent. The periods of genuine peace were brief enough that later historians had to give them names to mark them out as exceptional. The wars, by contrast, required no special designation. They were simply what happened. Athens fought Sparta. Sparta fought Argos. Corinth fought Corcyra. Thebes fought everyone who needed fighting. And then they all fought Persia. And then some of them fought each other again. And the rhythm continued across the centuries with the regularity of something that had been arranged rather than chosen. Male identity in this world was organized around the expectation of military participation in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. The citizen soldier was not a category of person. He was the category of person, the definition against which everything else was measured. The Greek concept of arete, excellence or virtue, applied to men translated most immediately and most viscerally into the capacity and willingness to stand in a phalanx and hold the line when the line was very frightening to hold. Courage in battle was not one value among several. It was the value that gave the others weight. A man who was generous and clever and just, but who flinched in battle, had failed at the central examination, and everyone understood that he had failed. This shaped boys from early childhood, not only in Sparta, where the shaping was administered with the systematic thoroughness that the Spartans brought to most things, but throughout the Greek world in varying degrees. Boys understood that they were being prepared for something specific, that the physical training, the wrestling, the running, the weapons instruction were not recreation but rehearsal, that the end point of male development was the man who could stand in bronze armour in the middle of a summer morning with a shield weighing 8 kilograms on his left arm and push forward into another man who was trying to kill him without running away. What the phalanx actually felt like to be inside is something the ancient sources describe with a vividness that the modern tendency to frame Greek warfare in terms of tactics and formations tends to soften. The armies advanced usually across agricultural land at a walking pace, close enough together that the men in a phalanx were in physical contact. The initial collision was a crash of shields and armour and bodies. The fighting in the densely packed ranks was not elegant. Men stabbed with shortened spears into the faces and throats of the men directly across from them. Men died standing up and were held upright by the pressure of the bodies around them. The smell was blood and heat and fear, and when one side broke and ran, the pursuing army killed the fleeing men from behind, because the men fleeing in a rout were the most vulnerable, and the killing in pursuit was where a significant portion of the casualties in Greek infantry battle actually occurred. The cities that lost battles lost considerably more than the battle. Defeat in the ancient Greek world was not a negotiating position. It was a condition that the victors were free to interpret as completely as they chose, and they often chose completely. Defeated cities were sometimes levelled, their populations killed or enslaved according to the practicalities of the moment and the degree of animosity the victors were carrying into the decision. The sack of Melos by Athens in 416 BCE, during which the Athenians killed the men of military age and enslaved the women and children, is famous in part because Thucydides recorded the debate that preceded it in such precise and unflinching detail, the Melian dialogue, in which the Athenians explained with remarkable calmness that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. What Thucydides understood, and what the dialogue conveys in its quiet way, is that Melos was not exceptional. The decision made at Melos was a version of decisions that Greek city-states made, and had made, and would make again, because the total destruction of a defeated enemy was not a war crime in a world that had not yet developed the concept. It was a military option. Raiding sat alongside formal warfare as a routine feature of Greek interstate relations. Armies that were not currently engaged in pitched battle moved through enemy territory burning crops, cutting down olive trees, and destroying farmland with a systematic efficiency that was intended to produce starvation as a strategic outcome. The olive tree is a slow investment. A tree planted took decades to bear fruit. An army with axes could destroy in an afternoon what had taken a generation to establish. The men who owned the trees knew this, and the men swinging the axes knew they knew it, and the calculation on both sides was always partly about what would not grow again for 30 years. The non-combatants absorbed all of this in ways that are less visible in the sources than the battles themselves. Women widowed by wars that came in cycles, children growing up in households that had lost their fathers and potentially their economic foundation, populations displaced when the fighting came close enough to make remaining in a city or a farming village impossible, hunger following the destruction of the food supply, with a consistency that made crop burning and siege warfare practically interchangeable in their domestic effects. And through all of it, the culture celebrated what it simultaneously required. It composed epic poetry about military excellence. It built temples with friezes depicting mythological battles. It staged dramatic competitions at festivals honoring gods, who were also frequently gods of war. It commemorated the dead at Marathon and Thermopylae with an intensity of grief and pride that held both feelings at once without finding the combination contradictory. Because it was not contradictory, it was accurate. The Greeks understood that war was terrible, and that it was also within the terms their world had given them, entirely unavoidable, and they built a culture that honoured the men who survived it and mourned the men who did not, and then sent the next generation to stand in the same formation and find out which category they belonged to. Ancient Greek society had an arrangement regarding sex and women that it managed to hold together for centuries without apparently finding the internal contradictions especially troubling. The arrangement worked in the way that arrangements work, when the people who benefit from them are also the people who design them. Prostitution in Greek cities was not hidden. It was licensed, taxed in some cities, geographically organized, and treated as a civic utility in roughly the same administrative spirit as the water supply. Athens had a tradition attributed to Solon in the 6th century of establishing state brothels staffed by enslaved women, the income from which was used to fund public temples. The details are debated by historians, but what is not debated is the broader reality. Organized sex work existed in Greek cities openly, was taxed as a commercial enterprise, and was considered entirely compatible with a functioning moral order. The moral order, it should be noted, had been designed by men. The women inside this system occupied several distinct categories, and the distinctions mattered enormously to the Greeks, if not always to modern observers looking back. At the bottom were the pornai, a word from which a more modern one derives, enslaved or extremely poor women working in brothels or on the street, whose transactions were brief and whose circumstances were largely invisible to the male writers who preserved most of what we know about this period. They had no legal standing, no family protection, no recourse. They were property in the functional sense, whether or not they were technically classified as slaves, and the conditions of their work were determined entirely by whoever owned or managed the establishment in which they worked. Their existence was acknowledged in the sources primarily in terms of price and availability. They were a feature of the urban landscape like a fountain or a marketplace stall, noted and then passed over. Above them in the social taxonomy sat the Hetairai, a word that translates roughly as companions or courtesans, and which designated something considerably more complicated than straightforward prostitution. Hetairai were educated women, often from outside Athens or from outside the citizen class, who formed longer-term arrangements with wealthy men, sometimes with a single patron, sometimes with several in succession. They attended symposia, the male drinking and intellectual gatherings from which respectable wives were entirely excluded. They conversed, they argued. They offered opinions on philosophy and rhetoric and politics, and were expected to hold their own in company that included some of the most prominent intellectual figures of the classical world. Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, was said by some ancient sources to have been a significant intellectual presence in her own right and possibly a teacher of rhetoric. Phryne, one of the most famous Hetairai of the 4th century, was wealthy enough to offer to fund the reconstruction of the walls of Thebes after their destruction by Alexander, on the condition that the rebuilt walls bear an inscription crediting her. The Thebans declined, which tells you something about how much status actually transferred from reputation to recognition, even for the most successful women in this category. The fundamental irony was this: the Hetairai had access to the intellectual and social life of Greek cities that respectable wives did not, and they paid for that access by existing entirely outside the protections that came with respectability. A wife was controlled and confined, but she was also in theory protected. Her household, her status, her children's legitimacy were guaranteed by a structure that required her fidelity and her seclusion, and in return gave her a particular kind of social location. A Hetairai was free to appear in public, to speak, to be present at the events where ideas were exchanged and decisions shaped, but she had no legal protection, no guaranteed position, no family structure to absorb her if the arrangement she depended on ended. She existed at the pleasure of men who found her useful and interesting, and when she ceased to be either, she ceased to have a social position that anyone was obliged to maintain. The men moving through this system experienced none of its contradictions personally. A citizen man could visit a brothel, maintain a Hetairai, and return home to a wife who was expected to know nothing and say nothing, and the culture supported all three activities simultaneously without cognitive discomfort. His sexual conduct was not regulated by the state or by social expectation in any meaningful way that restricted his access to women of any category. His wife's conduct was regulated completely, her movements monitored, her interactions with unrelated men minimized, her chastity required as a condition of the household's legitimacy and of her children's citizenship status. The double standard was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. What made this arrangement durable was that it distributed something to most of the parties involved, just not equally. Men received unrestricted access. Citizen wives received status and security at the cost of freedom. Hetairai received an approximation of intellectual and social participation at the cost of stability and protection. And enslaved sex workers received nothing except the continuation of conditions they had no power to alter. The system looked from the top like a natural arrangement in which different types of women occupied different niches suited to their natures. From any other position, it looked like what it was, an allocation of vulnerability in proportion to how little power each category of woman held to refuse it. Greek men wrote about Hetairai with a kind of admiring interest that they rarely directed at their own wives. The wives were respectable and therefore largely absent from literature except as figures in tragedy, which is another kind of absence. The Hetairai appeared in comedy, in philosophical dialogue, in legal speeches, in anecdote. They were interesting to write about because they were present in the spaces where writing and thinking happened. This felt to the men who wrote it like evidence of something natural about where intelligence lived. It did not occur to most of them that they had built the system that made it appear so. The Greek world had a framework for evaluating human beings, and it was not subtle. A person's worth was understood in relation to their usefulness, their capacity for participation, and their embodied fitness for the roles that society required them to perform. A man who could fight, deliberate, and manage property was a full participant. A man who could not do these things, or who could do them only partially, occupied a diminished position in ways that the culture did not particularly attempt to soften or disguise. Physical disability in ancient Greece did not come with a philosophical guarantee of inherent dignity. The ideal body was not merely an aesthetic preference, it was a civic standard. The athletic festivals, the military training regimes, the sculptural tradition that covered temple facades with images of perfect human forms, these were not decorative. They were declarations of what a human being was supposed to look like, and what a human being was supposed to be capable of. Deviation from that standard was not neutral. It required explanation, and the explanations the Greeks reached for were rarely kind. Visible difference attracted a range of responses, and most of them were uncomfortable for the person on the receiving end. Pity was available in the way that pity is always available, which is to say that it arrived with considerable condescension attached and did not translate automatically into practical assistance. Stigma was also available more reliably and did not require justification because the cultural assumption that bodily fitness reflected something meaningful about a person's moral and civic standing was widespread enough to function as common sense. A visible impairment could be interpreted as divine punishment, as evidence of a character flaw made external, or simply as a marker of reduced utility in a world that organized itself primarily around what people could do rather than what they were. The connection to infant exposure is direct and not incidental. The same logic that allowed Greek households to abandon newborns who appeared imperfect or physically compromised at birth continued operating throughout a person's life. The reasoning was consistent. A body that could not contribute to the household economy, military service, or civic function was a burden that the community was not automatically obliged to carry. The decision made at birth was simply the first application of a principle that remained operative afterward. Surviving infancy with a disability or developing one through illness or injury in later life meant navigating a world that had never built its social architecture around accommodating you. There were no meaningful public safety nets. Greek cities did not maintain institutions for the care of disabled citizens in any systematic way. Athens made some provision for disabled veterans of war, a pension of sorts though modest and contested, and the qualifications were restricted and the amounts periodically reduced during financial strain. The provision existed not because disability was recognized as deserving of social support in principle, but because military service was the specific activity the city required of its male citizens, and men who had been damaged in that service had a particular claim based on what they had already given. It was transactional rather than humanitarian. Men disabled by illness rather than warfare had no comparable claim. Women disabled by any cause had no claim of any kind that the city was obliged to honour. Survival for a disabled person, therefore, depended on what it always depended on in the Greek world when the city's interest was insufficient to provide assistance. Family. A household with resources could absorb a member who could not fully contribute. A poor household could not. This is one of the more honest features of ancient Greek social organization, that it did not bother to conceal the relationship between economic position and human welfare. Your survival was in practical terms a function of who your family was and what they could afford to maintain. Philosophy might suggest otherwise. Practical life confirmed the formula with considerable regularity. Greek medical tradition, emerging from the Hippocratic schools and later from figures like Galen, did attempt systematic approaches to illness and physical impairment. Observation was taken seriously. The idea that disease had natural causes rather than purely divine ones was a genuine intellectual development. Hippocratic texts contain careful descriptions of chronic conditions, of prognosis, of the expected progression of illnesses that physicians had watched in real patients over time. This was medicine that tried to understand rather than merely propitiate. It was also medicine that frequently had nothing effective to offer, that could describe suffering in detail while possessing no tools to relieve it, and that operated without anesthesia, antiseptic, or any pharmaceutical intervention more sophisticated than herbal preparations of variable reliability. The Hippocratic concern with prognosis, with predicting outcomes, rather than simply treating symptoms, produced something that was intellectually honest and humanly uncomfortable. A frank accounting of who was likely to recover and who was not, and an implicit understanding that the physician's resources were best directed toward those with reasonable chances. The dying, the chronically ill without prospect of improvement, the severely disabled, occupied a category that the medical tradition tended to acknowledge and then move past. The philosophers offered more nuanced positions, as philosophers generally do, which is part of what makes the contrast with ordinary practice so persistent. Aristotle wrote about the good life in terms that could accommodate physical limitation to some degree, identifying virtues of character that did not strictly require a perfect body. The Stoics went further, arguing that virtue was the only true good and that it was available regardless of physical circumstance, that a wise person in chains retained something the chains could not touch. These were real ideas, seriously held, and they produced genuine intellectual traditions about what made a life worth living that did not reduce entirely to bodily capacity. And then you look at the world these philosophers inhabited, in which children were left to die for looking wrong, in which disability reduced your civic standing without ceremony or appeal, in which the beautiful body was literally carved into stone and mounted on public buildings as a representation of the human ideal, and you understand that philosophy and practice were operating in separate registers that only occasionally intersected. The Greek world was not unique in this. Most human societies across most of history have organized their treatment of vulnerable people around usefulness rather than inherent worth, and then developed philosophical traditions that claimed otherwise. What Greece offers is a particularly clear view of the gap, because both the philosophy and the practice are well documented, and because the gap between them is wide enough that you cannot easily pretend it does not exist. The Greek household was not a refuge from the power structures of the public world. It was a smaller, more intimate version of them, with its own hierarchy, its own mechanisms of control, and its own set of relationships in which authority and dependency were as clearly defined as anything in the courts or the assembly. The oikos, the household, was the fundamental unit of Greek social organization, and it ran on a logic that would be recognizable to anyone who has spent time studying how power operates when it has no one to answer to. At the head of the household stood the Kyrios, the male guardian who was in practical terms an authority without meaningful external check over almost everything that occurred within his walls. He controlled the property, he controlled the finances, he made decisions about marriage, about children, about the economic activities of every person under his roof. His wife, his children, his enslaved workers, his dependent relatives, all of them existed within a structure that he defined, and the definition was not subject to appeal. The Athenian legal system recognized his authority as essentially absolute in domestic matters, and while there were theoretical limits, the enforcement of those limits depended on external parties who rarely had occasion or incentive to involve themselves in what happened inside a private household. The wife occupied a position that combined legal incapacity with genuine domestic responsibility in a ratio that would have been maddening had the culture provided any vocabulary for finding it maddening. She could not own property in her own name above a certain minimal threshold. She could not enter into contracts. She could not appear in court. She was represented legally by her Kyrios, first her father, then her husband, and if both were dead, a male relative or guardian appointed by the court. Inside the house, however, she managed significant operations. She supervised the enslaved workers, organized the household economy, oversaw food production and textile work, and was expected to do all of this competently, while remaining entirely dependent on her husband's continued goodwill for her material security. The combination was not accidental. It reproduced daily the condition of controlled usefulness that the Greek world generally assigned to women, extracting labor and management capacity while retaining authority and ownership with the men. Children in the Greek household were subject to the father's authority in ways that had no equivalent in most modern legal systems. The right of the Kyrios over his children was not merely social custom. It was the same logic that permitted infant exposure, extended into the years that followed. A father who had chosen to raise a child had not thereby surrendered his authority over that child. He retained it, enforced it, and exercised it through discipline that the culture considered entirely appropriate, and that observers from outside the household were not expected to question. The education of sons was a matter of considerable investment and attention in households that could afford it. But investment is not the same thing as tenderness, and the two could coexist with the understanding that the child's purpose in the household was to develop into someone useful, which meant developing in accordance with the father's assessment of what useful looked like. Enslaved workers were present in virtually every Greek household above the level of bare subsistence, sometimes only one or two, in wealthier households significantly more. Their labor supported the household economy entirely. They cooked, cleaned, managed children, worked looms, carried water, performed agricultural labor on attached land, and provided whatever else the household required. They had no legal standing. They were property. The Kyrios could sell them, lend them out, punish them physically, or in some contexts deploy their testimony in legal proceedings only after torture, because the Greek legal system held that enslaved persons' testimony was only reliable when extracted under pain, a requirement that says something about how the culture understood the relationship between truth and compulsion. What is historically remarkable, and not in a comfortable way, is that genuine affection could and did exist within these relationships alongside the coercion. Greek literature and philosophical writing contain real examples of attachment between enslaved workers and the families who owned them, of grief when an enslaved person died, of relationships that looked from the inside like loyalty and from the outside like the predictable emotional responses of people living in close quarters for years or decades. None of this changed the legal or material reality. The affection was not a contradiction of the power structure. It was something that grew within it, and it coexisted with the fact that the person who was genuinely mourned could have been sold the week before without their consent and without legal recourse. The enforcement of household hierarchy was in this sense invisible, precisely because it was so pervasive. It did not require daily drama because everyone within the structure already understood their position and the consequences of stepping outside it. A wife who overstepped, a child who disobeyed, an enslaved worker who resisted, all faced consequences calibrated to their rank, which is to say that the lower your position in the household, the more direct and physical the available consequences were. The Kyrios who struck an enslaved worker was exercising a recognized right. The Kyrios who struck his wife occupied a grayer area culturally, but one that external parties were unlikely to intervene in. The household contained these realities quietly behind its walls, and the walls were understood by everyone to be the boundary of other people's business. What private life in the Greek household depended on most was exactly what the previous section's logic predicted: your rank, your gender, and whether someone owned you. These were not incidental features of household life. They were the structural conditions on which everything else rested. Whether you ate well or poorly, whether you slept in security or fear, whether you had any say in whom you married, or whether your children lived or were exposed, whether you could leave or were required to stay, all of it derived from the same question. Where did you stand in the hierarchy, and what could the person above you do to you if they chose? The household was the place where the Greek world's deepest assumptions about power and human worth were practiced every day, without ceremony, without record, and without the philosophical apparatus that surrounded the public institutions. It was ordinary. That is precisely what made it so complete. The household that contained all of this hierarchy, all of this carefully calibrated power, was also a household that lived in intimate proximity to death. Not death as an occasional interruption to normal life, but death as a regular feature of it, as expected and as ordinary as the changing of seasons. The ancient Greek world did not have the option of treating mortality as something that happened elsewhere, to other people, at a sufficient distance to be managed emotionally. It happened inside the house frequently to people of all ages, and the culture had developed an elaborate set of rituals and beliefs to manage the fact that there was nowhere to look that didn't eventually return your gaze. Infant mortality was high enough that children were not always named immediately at birth, and the period of vulnerability extended well past infancy. Childhood illness, fever, infection, the ordinary complications of living in a world without antibiotics or clean water infrastructure, took children at rates that the modern world would find catastrophic and that the Greek world found tragic, but not surprising. A woman who reached her 40s having buried several children was not unusual. She was ordinary. Women themselves died in childbirth at rates that made every pregnancy a genuine negotiation with survival, and the women who assisted at births, the midwives who worked without the tools or knowledge that would make the process significantly safer, understood that outcome as something you could influence but never guarantee. Childbirth in the Greek world was a medical emergency that recurred throughout a woman's adult life, and that the culture acknowledged as dangerous while providing no particularly effective means of making it less so. Disease moved through communities in patterns that the Greeks understood as divine intervention, and that we now recognize as the epidemiology of populations without immunity or sanitation infrastructure. Plague, dysentery, malaria in the lowland regions, the ordinary accumulation of infections that circulate wherever people live in proximity, all of these shaped the experience of life in ways that made death not a distant abstraction but a neighbour. When Thucydides described the plague that struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War, killing somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the city's population, he was describing something that would have been unimaginable by scale but not by category. Athenians had seen disease before. They had buried family members before. The scale was new. The experience of loss was not. War added its own contribution, reliably and seasonally, since the Greek world conducted military campaigns during the summer months as a matter of practical logistics, which meant that men of military age disappeared into campaigns for significant portions of the year and returned, or did not return, in the autumn. Death in warfare was accepted as a normal occupational hazard of adult male citizenship, which is to say it was accepted as normal by the people who organised the campaigns and grieved as a particular and devastating loss by the people who received the bodies or the news. These are not incompatible responses. The Greek world held them simultaneously. What the Greeks had developed, in response to all of this proximity to death, was a system of ritual that made the management of the dead a structured and obligatory activity. The body of a person who died required proper preparation, washing, anointing with oil, being wrapped in a shroud and laid out for a period of mourning before burial. During this period, family members, particularly women, were expected to perform visible grief. Lamentation was not private. It was public, physical, vocal, and considered necessary. Women tore their hair, beat their chests, sang funeral dirges that had conventional forms and that served the social function of marking the loss as real, witnessed and appropriately mourned. The restraint of grief was not a Greek virtue in the context of death. Expression was. The burial itself had to be performed correctly, and the consequences of failing to do so were understood to be serious in a sense that was not merely social. The Greek understanding of the afterlife held that the shade, the psyche, the diminished surviving essence of the dead person passed to the underworld, to the realm of Hades, and was received there into whatever existence the dead inhabited. The condition of that reception depended on proper burial rites having been performed. A person who had been buried correctly, who had received the rituals and ideally a coin placed in the mouth or on the eyes, as payment for Charon's ferry across the river Styx, could make the crossing and take their place among the shades. A person who had not been buried, whose body had been left unburied, was condemned to wander on the near shore of the river for 100 years before being permitted to cross. This was not understood as a metaphor. It was understood as a description of what actually happened. The fear of dying without burial was consequently genuine and pervasive. Soldiers killed in campaigns in foreign territory might not receive proper burial. Those lost at sea certainly would not. Criminals, whose bodies were sometimes denied burial as additional punishment, suffered a fate that extended past their death into whatever came after it. Sophocles built a tragedy around precisely this fear, around the question of who had the obligation to bury a body when the state had forbidden it, and his audience understood the stakes without requiring them to be explained because the stakes were part of the culture's operating assumptions. What is striking, sitting with all of this, is not that the Greeks feared death. Everyone fears death. What is striking is how thoroughly they had integrated that fear into the texture of ordinary life. Death did not arrive as an interruption to Greek experience. It was woven into the daily fabric of it, acknowledged in the rituals of mourning and burial, present in the prayers and sacrifices offered to the gods for protection, visible in the grave monuments that lined the roads outside every city, and carried quietly by everyone who had already buried someone and who knew they would bury someone else before it was done. The Greeks did not look away from mortality. They did not have the luxury, and they had built their culture in ways that made looking directly at it not just possible but required. The Greeks who built temples to proportion and wrote tragedies of extraordinary psychological complexity also found it entirely reasonable to gather in public spaces and laugh at the humiliated, the beaten, and the degraded. These are not contradictions if you understand them as products of the same culture. They are simply different rooms in the same house. Greek comedy is frequently celebrated in survey courses as the ancestor of Western humour, the origin point of satire, the place where the joke about power begins. And there is truth in that. Aristophanes, whose comedies survive and who remains genuinely funny at a distance of 2.5 millennia, wrote plays that mocked politicians by name, lampooned generals during active wars, and satirized philosophers in ways that apparently annoyed at least one philosopher enough that he mentioned it at his trial. This is the sophisticated tradition, the one that gets quoted in discussions of free speech and artistic courage. The other tradition, operating in the same theatrical space and for the same audiences, involved costumes with exaggerated phalluses, grotesque masks, slapstick violence directed at stock figures, and jokes whose targets were women, foreigners, enslaved people, and anyone whose appearance, disability, or social position made them available for public mockery without consequence. Both traditions were Greek comedy. They coexisted without apparent tension, because the audience that appreciated the political satire also enjoyed the humiliation of whoever stood below them in the social order, and there was always someone who stood below. The theatre itself was a civic institution attached to religious festivals, primarily the Dionysia, the festival held in honour of Dionysus, god of wine, transformation, and the dissolution of ordinary constraints. Attendance was a participatory act of citizenship for free men. Thousands gathered in the open-air theatres that the Greeks constructed with characteristic attention to acoustics and sight lines, and they watched tragedies in the morning and comedies in the afternoon, and they ate and drank and shouted responses to the performers in ways that made the performance more of a communal event than a passive reception. The religious framing is important. The festival context meant that behaviours which might otherwise be regulated were temporarily licensed. The Dionysia was understood as a space in which normal social rules bent, in which excess was appropriate, in which laughter at things that could not ordinarily be laughed at was not merely permitted but ritualized. The release valve theory of social control would say this served a function, and perhaps it did. But the people at the receiving end of the licensed mockery, the women being caricatured, the enslaved characters being beaten for the audience's amusement, the foreigners whose accents and customs provided the punchline, were not experiencing a release valve. They were experiencing the public confirmation that their humiliation was funny, which is a different thing entirely. The symposium, the drinking party that served as the primary social institution of elite Greek male life, had its own forms of entertainment built on similar principles. Symposia involved reclining on couches, drinking wine diluted with water at ratios the host controlled, listening to music and poetry, conducting philosophical discussion, and also, depending on the evening, watching hired entertainers perform. Those entertainers included acrobats, musicians, and women, categorized as entertainers whose roles blurred into sexual availability in ways that the guests considered entertainment, and that the women involved experienced as the conditions of their employment. Enslaved attendants moved through these spaces serving and being visible, and the humour of the symposium frequently deployed them as comic material, their status, their appearance, their imagined inner lives available for appropriation as punchline whenever the conversation required it. The mockery that organised itself around outsiders was not incidental. It was structural Greek comedy returned repeatedly to the figure of the barbarian. The non-Greek whose speech was parodied, whose customs were rendered absurd, whose failure to be Greek was itself the joke. Women in comedy were not portrayed as individuals with interior lives, but as types. The shrew, the drunk, the scheming wife, the simple creature who couldn't be trusted with anything important. And the audience laughed at these types without discomfort because the types confirmed what the audience already believed and wanted to believe. Aristophanes' Lysistrata, frequently taught as a proto-feminist text, because women organize and ultimately prevail, is also a play in which the entire premise that women could withhold sex as political leverage is framed as both absurd and inevitable, because women being controlled by their appetites is presented as a fact of nature that the play exploits rather than interrogates. The sophistication is real. The assumptions underneath it are also real. Physical punishment of enslaved people was not merely a private household matter. It could be public, witnessed, even laughed at. The beaten slave is a stock figure of Greek comedy, the character who arrives having been punished, whose injuries are played for humour, whose suffering is presented as the normal cost of getting things wrong when you have no status to protect you. Audiences watched this and found it funny in the way that audiences find things funny when the suffering belongs to someone they have been taught to regard as less than themselves. The laughter was not cruelty in the individual sense. It was something more systematic than that. It was a collective agreement renewed each time the joke landed, that this category of person existed to absorb what others would not. What the festivals, the theatre, the symposium, and the public spaces of Greek life had in common was that they organised pleasure around hierarchy. The joke worked because everyone in the space agreed, implicitly, and through laughter, on who the joke was permitted to land on. Sophistication and brutality shared the same stage because the same culture produced both, and the audience that wept at Oedipus in the morning returned in the afternoon for the comedy in which the enslaved man got hit again, and the woman was stupid again, and the foreigner couldn't speak properly again. They did not experience this as a contradiction. The tragedies explored what it meant to be human. The comedies confirmed reliably and to communal satisfaction who counted as fully human and who did not. The Greeks built a theatre capable of holding both. They filled it enthusiastically for centuries. The theatre confirmed it in the afternoon. The assembly confirmed it in the morning. And the thing that the assembly confirmed with the weight of law and tradition and considerable philosophical justification was that the capacity for self-governance was not a human quality. It was a Greek quality. More specifically, it was a free, adult, male, Athenian-born quality, and the list of disqualifications was longer than the list of qualifications by a considerable margin. Athenian democracy is taught as an origin point, the birthplace of political freedom, the first experiment in collective self-rule, the ancestor of every parliament and legislature and elected body that followed it. This is not entirely wrong. The Athenians did something genuinely new when they organized public decision-making around the votes of citizens rather than the inherited authority of kings. The assembly, the ecclesia, met on a hill called the Pnyx, and free men gathered there and spoke and voted, and the city's direction was shaped by that process in ways that no purely monarchical system permitted. The idea was real, the practice was real, the limitation, which was also real, was that the category of people who could participate in it was drawn with extraordinary narrowness around a population that represented a small fraction of the people who actually lived in Athens. Women did not vote. Women did not speak in the assembly. Women did not hold public office, serve on juries, or participate in any formal mechanism of political decision-making. This was not an oversight or a temporary condition pending reform. It was foundational. The Athenian conception of citizenship was organized around the capacity for military service, for bearing arms in defense of the city, and women were excluded from that role, which made their exclusion from political life seem, to the men who had arranged it this way, entirely logical. The logic was circular in the way that self-serving logic tends to be, but it was stated with great confidence and not seriously questioned by the people whose comfort depended on not questioning it. Enslaved people, who may have constituted a third to nearly half of the population of Attica at the height of classical Athens, had no political standing of any kind. They were property, and property does not vote. The democracy that Pericles celebrated in his famous funeral oration, the system he described as an example to its neighbours, a city open to the world, was operating at the same moment on the labour of tens of thousands of people who had no voice in anything it decided. The silver mines at Laurion, which funded the Athenian fleet, which made Athens a naval power, which underwrote the democracy's military confidence, were worked by enslaved people in conditions of extraordinary brutality. The connection between the freedom of some and the total absence of freedom for others was not incidental. It was structural. The leisure that allowed citizens to participate in public life, to attend the assembly, to sit on juries that could last all day, was purchased by the labour of people who had no such leisure because they had no freedom at all. Then there were the metics, the resident foreigners. Athens was a commercial city that attracted craftsmen, merchants and intellectuals from across the Greek world and beyond, and many of these people lived in Athens for years, decades, sometimes their entire lives, paid taxes, served in the military when required, contributed to the city's economic and cultural life in ways that were acknowledged and depended upon, and were nonetheless excluded entirely from political participation. A metic could not vote. A metic could not own land in Attica. A metic's legal standing in court required a citizen patron to represent him. The philosopher Aristotle, who spent decades in Athens, who founded the Lyceum, who wrote the Politics, a foundational text of Western political thought, was a metic. He could not vote in the city he analysed. He was required to leave when political winds shifted against him, which they eventually did, and he went. The city used what he contributed, and did not extend him the standing it reserved for those born to it. Even among free male citizens, the access to political life was not uniformly distributed. Certain offices were restricted to the wealthy. The assumption that a man of property had a greater stake in the city's stability than a man without it was not challenged with any consistency, and the practical demands of attendance at the assembly, which met frequently and required physical presence, favoured those who did not need to work every day simply to eat. Pay for jury service and later for assembly attendance was introduced in the 5th century, partly to allow poorer citizens to participate, and this was genuinely progressive relative to what had existed before. It was also evidence that without it, the system had functioned predominantly for those who could afford to show up. What made the exclusion feel natural to those who benefited from it was the same thing that makes all exclusions feel natural to their beneficiaries, which is that the beneficiaries defined the terms. The Aristotelian political philosophy that organized Greek thinking on these matters argued that some people were suited by nature for command and others for obedience, that the capacity for rational deliberation was unevenly distributed, and that the political community was correctly organized around those who possessed it fully. Women lacked the deliberative faculty in the right proportion. Enslaved people were enslaved because their nature had fitted them for it. Foreigners were attached to other places and other loyalties, and could not be trusted with decisions about this one. The argument was internally consistent given its premises, and the premises were exactly the premises you would construct if you were already in power and wished to remain there. The Greek citizen who participated in the democracy understood himself as inhabiting the highest form of human life available. He was a man who ruled himself, who contributed to ruling his city, who was beholden to no master. The freedom was genuine and was experienced as such. What he did not experience because he did not need to was the full accounting of what his freedom rested on. The women managed at home. The enslaved people worked the mines and the fields and the households. The metics kept the trades running and the goods moving. The citizens voted. The city called itself free. By its own definitions it was, and so we arrive at the question that the entire preceding account has been quietly building toward, which is how to hold two things at once that seem at first to resist being held together. The Greeks gave us Socrates. They gave us the dialogues of Plato, which are still read, still argued over, still assigned in universities by people who find in them something worth arguing about 2,500 years after they were written. They gave us Aristotle's systematic attempt to understand everything: logic, biology, ethics, politics, rhetoric, tragedy, the nature of friendship, the structure of a good life. They gave us Sophocles writing Antigone, in which a woman defies the state on the grounds of a higher moral law, and the play makes her right and the king wrong, and the audience was expected to feel this and did. They gave us Euripides writing Medea, in which the audience is made to sit with the interior experience of a woman driven to extremity by betrayal and powerlessness. They gave us Thucydides attempting to write history without the interference of gods, tracking instead the behaviour of human institutions under pressure, and finding in that behaviour something worth understanding rather than merely recording. They gave us democracy as a concept and a practice, however limited its operation. They gave us the idea that argument, conducted publicly, was a legitimate way to determine what a city should do. This is not nothing. It is in fact a very great deal, and the admiration that has accumulated around it across centuries is not entirely misplaced. It is also the case that Plato's Republic, which is among the most celebrated works of political philosophy in the Western tradition, was written by a man who owned enslaved people and found nothing philosophically inconsistent about this. Aristotle, whose Nicomachean Ethics remains a foundational text in moral philosophy, argued with complete seriousness that some human beings were slaves by nature, that their capacity for reason was sufficient to recognize the instructions of a master, but not sufficient to direct their own lives, and that the institution of slavery was therefore not an injustice but a natural arrangement. He said this in a work called The Politics. He meant it. He was not being ironic or describing someone else's view. It was his considered position, reached through the same careful reasoning he applied to everything else, and it did not disturb him. Socrates, who is remembered as the man who died rather than abandon the pursuit of truth, was tried and executed by the Athenian democracy in 399 BCE. The charge was impiety and corrupting the youth. The conviction was by a jury of his fellow citizens. The democracy in this instance killed the philosopher, and Plato, whose dialogues constructed the Socrates we remember, concluded partly from this experience that democracy was not a particularly reliable system for arriving at truth, that it was instead a form of government that flattered the worst instincts of the crowd and gave power to people whose principal qualification was the ability to persuade other people. Plato's preferred alternative involved philosopher kings. It did not involve women in positions of power, with one complicated exception in the Republic, and it did not involve the enslaved population at all. The ideal city was organized around an intellectual elite, whose fitness to govern was determined by their demonstrated capacity for philosophical reasoning. The irony that this would have conveniently placed Plato near the top of the hierarchy was not something Plato appeared to find troubling. What is striking, when you look at it directly, is not that these thinkers failed to transcend their world. No one transcends their world entirely. What is striking is the specific shape of the gap between what the philosophy claimed and what the society practiced. The philosophical tradition was genuinely interested in questions of justice. Plato wrote an entire dialogue about it. Aristotle distinguished between just and unjust constitutions with considerable precision. The Stoics, who came later in the Hellenistic period, argued for a universal human reason that in principle crossed the boundaries of citizen and slave, Greek and barbarian, free and bound. Some Stoic thinkers said things about the fundamental dignity of enslaved people that sound remarkably close to what would later be called natural rights. They said these things. The institution they were describing continued without significant interruption. The challenge to normalized cruelty that the philosophy occasionally gestured toward was almost never extended to the point of institutional consequence. Philosophical texts questioning the justice of slavery were written in households maintained by enslaved labor. Dramas in which women spoke with intelligence, moral authority, and righteous anger were performed at festivals from which women may have been partially or entirely excluded as audience members, in a city where those same women had no legal standing, no political voice, and no ability to own property independently. The play asked you to feel the injustice of Medea's position, while the society ensured that position remained structurally intact. Later centuries, particularly the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, looked back at ancient Greece and saw what they wanted to see, which was a civilization that had achieved beauty, reason, and self-governance. The democracy, the philosophy, the architecture, the drama, the sculpture that idealized the human form, as if the human form were itself an argument for human dignity. These things were real and were admired and were held up as models. The slavery was acknowledged in the footnotes. The exposure of infants was noted as a custom of the time. The systematic control of women was described as a feature of ancient societies generally, not worth dwelling on too long. The pederastic relationships were translated carefully into abstractions about mentorship and the love of beauty, or simply not translated at all in the editions distributed to schools. This selective inheritance is not unique to how we remember Greece. It is how civilizations are generally remembered by the people who find them useful to admire. You take the parts that support the story you're telling about yourself and your own tradition, and the parts that complicate it recede into the background of the curriculum, into the specialist literature, into the footnotes of footnotes. What the full account of ancient Greek normality asks of us is not that we stop admiring what was genuinely admirable. It is that we notice the mechanism by which admiration operates, the thing it highlights, and the thing it prefers not to look at directly. Every civilization, including the one you're living in now, will eventually be assessed by people with enough distance to see both. The question is not whether there will be a reckoning. There always is. The question is only how long it takes for the smell to reach the window. What ancient Greece reveals, when you look at it without the softening effect of selective memory, is something that is less about ancient Greece specifically, and more about how ordinary life is constructed everywhere and always, which is to say, built on arrangements that the people living inside them do not experience as arrangements at all, but simply as how things are. The infant left on the hillside was not left by a monster. It was left by a household making a calculation that the household understood to be rational, and that the society around it had provided no framework for questioning. The girl married at 14 to a man 3 times her age, entered a transaction that her father, her future husband, and the law all regarded as entirely correct. The enslaved person grinding grain before dawn in a household that also produced philosophical dialogues about the nature of justice did not inhabit a contradiction that anyone in that household felt compelled to resolve. The Spartan boy beaten deliberately, exposed to hunger, taught that the pain was the point, grew into a man who would subject the next generation of boys to the same process and call it education, because it had always been called education, and the results spoke for themselves. If you defined the results narrowly enough, this is the pattern that repeats across everything covered in the preceding account. The exposure of infants, the transaction of marriage, the legal non-existence of women, the slavery that underwrote everything, including the philosophy, the deliberate brutality of Spartan upbringing, the relationships between older men and boys that were encoded into the educational and social system, the public punishments, the medicine that could kill as efficiently as the illness, the animal sacrifices that punctuated daily religious life, the warfare that was not exceptional but expected, the double standard that allowed men freedoms that destroyed women for the same exercise, the treatment of the disabled and the sick as people who had simply lost the argument of survival, the household hierarchies that kept women and children and servants in states of permanent supervised dependency, the funerary obligations that dictated whether a soul could rest, the entertainments built on the suffering of people who had no choice about participating. None of these were fringe behaviors. None of them were the practices of people considered cruel by their own contemporaries. They were woven into the ordinary fabric of daily life at every level, which is precisely what makes them difficult to see from inside and difficult to fully absorb from outside. The polished image of classical civilization, the marble, the philosophy, the democracy, the drama, the geometric logic of the temples exists because later centuries needed it to exist. They needed a usable past that supported a story about the steady ascent of reason and human dignity. That story required a starting point that was already admirable, already recognizably civilized, already pointing in the right direction. Ancient Greece was assigned that role, and everything that complicated the assignment was quietly moved to the margins. What you're left with when you move it back toward the center is not a ruined civilization, but a more honest one. One that was capable of extraordinary things and also capable of the ordinary cruelties that extraordinary things were sometimes built on top of. The question that follows from all of this, and it is a question worth sitting with, is what the equivalent account will look like for the civilization you are currently living in. Not as a rhetorical trick or as a way of dismissing the genuine achievements of the present, but as a genuine exercise in the kind of historical perspective that the Greeks themselves at their best were interested in. Thucydides wanted to understand how human institutions behaved under pressure. He thought that understanding was worth something. The application of that same understanding to our own moment is what the exercise asks for. There are arrangements that surround you now that you do not experience as arrangements. Systems that produce suffering at a scale that is documented, reported, measured, and available in the form of reports and newspaper articles and rising numbers in the relevant columns of the relevant studies. And those systems continue because the people inside them have not yet found the smell sufficiently aggressive for it to reach the window of the people who could write the checks. This is not a uniquely ancient problem. It is not a Greek problem. It is the problem of all human societies at every point in time, which is that the distance between knowing something and finding it bad enough to change is a distance that is almost always longer than it should be. What ancient Greece reveals is that civilization and cruelty are not opposites. They are, in certain arrangements, collaborators, and the civilization that produces Antigone and the civilization that leaves infants on hillsides and the civilization that builds the Parthenon on enslaved labor are the same civilization, held in the same hands, described in the same language, remembered selectively by everyone who came after. That is what makes it worth looking at directly. Not to feel superior to the past, which is both easy and useless, but to practice the particular discomfort of looking at a thing fully with all its admirable and indefensible parts in the same frame at the same time. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If any part of this account stayed with you, or kept you awake when you were hoping it would put you to sleep, tell us which one in the comments. And if you want more of this kind of slow, detailed journey through the things history prefers to mention quietly, subscribe, because there is considerably more where this came from.